Now. So good afternoon and welcome to the 5th edition of the IIMA Public Policy Alumni Special Interest Group webinar series. As you know, the IIMA Public Policy ASIG is a group of alumni and faculty of the Institute with expertise and interest in the fields of public policy and development. It aims to foster collaboration among the IIMA community, which is faculty, students, and alumni, and the wider world of public policy practitioners to contribute to India's inclusive development agenda. The webinar series aims to bring the thoughts, views, and expertise of renowned experts to the IIMA community. And the webinars are structured as a dialogue between two eminent speakers, the invited guest, and IIMA faculty. Today's topic is about Atmanirbhar Bharat. To share his views on this important topic, it is our privilege to welcome Shri Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India and the co-chair of the G20 Framework Working Group. Prior to that, Shri Sanyal spent 2 decades in the financial sector and was a global strategist and managing director at Deutsche Bank till 2015. We also have with us Professor Sebastian Morris, Professor of Economics and Public Systems at IIMA. To all the participants who have joined in, please send in your questions in the Q&A section. Professor Morris will pick a few from it and address it to Mr. Sanyal. And we'll try to get in as many of those as possible. Now I hand over the platform to Professor Morris to take over the proceedings.
Yeah, it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome someone as lively as Sanjeev Sanyal. Besides being the one of the members of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council, he is known for his books, and these are really delightful books, which I'm sure would have informed, entertained, and provoked a lot of us. Okay, I must say that I have also read and gone through some of them. They are very, very interesting, and I really look forward to this interaction with Dr. Sanyal. Yeah. So before I hand over, I'll just take a couple of minutes. He mentions that India is now waking up from its slumber. I really hope that is true, and we all hope so. I mean, our independence and the resurgence that happened in the second half, from starting somewhere around the last century, gave us all tremendous hopes, and I'm sure those hopes are alive and they are being pushed up and so on. And if I may just put it, one of the major events in the world which doesn't get recognized as such by historians is the transformation of China, which lifted some 600 million people out of poverty. And this has been one of the most important events since World War II. If I may add, India's democratic transition, that means such a diverse people, becoming a democracy and setting up an inclusive process of doing so, would, I think, be one of the greatest political events in this, in the 20th, 21st centuries. Okay, hopefully that would be very successful, and therefore our success would be double that of China if we can make that economic transition. So today, we have with us Dr. Sanyal, who will speak about Atmanirbhar, because Atmanirbhar, among other things, sets out for India to become a manufacturing powerhouse. That's the hope. That's the way people have understood it. So let's hear from him in what way it would, take India forward in manufacturing, in value addition in India, in helping us in pushing the economic transition in India. The economic transition meaning India moving unambiguously to being an advanced country. So over to you, Dr. Sanyal.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to speak to all of you this Saturday afternoon. And Professor Morris, it's a very big honor to be introduced by you. We spoke yesterday as well. So as I believe is a tradition, I should speak for a short period of time and then we have a conversation. So what I'll do is I'll give you some sense of the kind of thinking process that is going into economic policy making right now. As you pointed out, this is a particularly interesting moment in history when you take a longer view of time. And hopefully I'll convince you that we are not as crazy as some people may think. There is some thinking behind the kinds of policies we are putting in place, and hopefully we'll convince you they're good policies, but at the very least, you will appreciate the thinking behind it, and consequently, it'll also give you a flavor of the kinds of things we are likely to do into the future. So, the crisis that we have faced because of COVID is no ordinary shock to the global economy. It's obviously not just an India thing, it's a global thing. It's the biggest challenge the global economy has faced since the Great Depression and the Second World War. It is also a shock that leads us into areas with enormous uncertainty. So in order to understand how we are thinking about making our way through this uncertainty, let me take you back to March. What did we know in middle of March as we were entering this phase? Basically, we knew that something very nasty had happened in China. We didn't know exactly what it was, but we knew it had been quite a big shock. In fact, we still don't know exactly what happened. And then we knew that it had spread to Italy, and it was killing a lot of people, and then it was spreading to other places, and maybe may have even spread to India to some extent. That was basically what we knew at that stage. Now, like all governments, we reached out to experts in the field of epidemiology, and they, epidemics experts, told us a wide variety of things that are possible. So there were experts who thought that this was nothing much more than a bad influenza outbreak. And there were others who also forecast that by July, we would have 300 to 500 million people infected and literally millions of people dead in India alone. So that was the range of outcomes. Now, the only thing we understood out of all of this is that we were dealing with absolute uncertainty. Now, many countries dealt with this by opting for one or the other model of epidemic spread. Some of them opted for herd immunity kind of approach, which the UK did, and then it backtracked. The Singaporeans took a particular approach, and they also changed track. There was the Swedish model and many other models as well. Now, the problem with us was that with 1.3 billion people, once we had taken a particular path, we had no choice but to stick to that path. You can't change path halfway through, like Singapore. So what do you do when you don't know exactly what is the nature of the disease? There's a wide range of things that can happen, and we have no chance of backtracking once the decision has been taken. So we opted for something called a barbell strategy. Those of you from finance background and those who are now into derivatives and things will know what a barbell strategy is. Basically, what you do in a barbell strategy is you hedge for the very worst, and you then use a step-by-step feedback loop-based system to make your way into the darkness of uncertainty. So this is precisely what we did. The first 3 weeks of absolute complete lockdown was about this. It was not because we were 100% sure exactly what the nature was. Quite to the contrary, we were buying ourselves time to understand the nature of the disease, put in some testing systems, put in some medical responses, watch what other countries were doing and gathering information, so that we were able to then, in the subsequent rounds, be able to ease things up. And that's precisely what we did. Gingerly initially and more confidently later, began to open things up with a feedback loop. Now, very often people ask us, why is it that here we are in mid-August, we have clearly got far more infections, and yet we are unlocking now when we were willing to do a shutdown in March? Why are we doing this? Well, it's the barbell strategy. Once we had a better idea of what we were dealing with, since time had passed, since we now have some amount of testing and medical responses in place, we now have a much better way of making the economic to health trade-off. And that is precisely what we are doing. We're making some trade-offs. We know that the disease may not have been as dangerous as some of the worst forecasts were. It is still pretty dangerous for certain demographics, So we are able to make certain trade-offs. So that is exactly what we have done on the economy as well. Many other countries opted for very large demand rebuild packages, trillions of dollars. Japan came up with 20% of GDP and so on. Now, we didn't. Why didn't we do that? For exactly the same reason. We were doing a barbell strategy where we basically cushion for the very worst outcome. And then with a feedback loop, we respond step by step over time. So what we did is right in the beginning, if you remember, we made sure that food was available to everybody. Until November, basically, food is freely available to the poorest sections. Some money is also being transferred to the poor. Gas was provided. Now, this is not going to solve poverty. We know that. Nor is it an attempt to rebuild demand with this. All it is doing is providing a cushion, safety net. Same thing is true for what we are doing for the business sector. We pushed back certain deadlines, created some moratoriums. For the MSME sector, we created a 100% government guarantee for incremental loans for MSMEs up to 3 lakh crores, and so on and so forth. You know the whole list. I'm not going to give you a list of measures, but the key aspect of it is that it was all about cushioning and safety nets. Nobody is claiming that this is a rebuild of demand and we are getting it going. Now, why weren't we willing to do that? Well, quite obvious. We were imposing on the system for health reasons a lockdown. That is the equivalent from the economy perspective of pressing the brakes. There's no point in trying to press the accelerator when we are also pressing the brake. So as we now lift the foot off the brake, we will now be in a position to press the accelerator as well. And that is the phase we are now entering. Now, in this context, again, please appreciate the difference that we have, and I'll come to Atmanirbhar Bharat here. There is a difference in our approach with that of the rest of the world. We have mixed in our approach a supply side element, which most countries have not. Most countries have gone for a demand approach. This does not mean that we don't think demand is important. We do, but we will be building that out. And here, let me say that we do have space for a policy response on the demand side as well. As the Reserve Bank governor just last week in his mentioned, and then again reiterated in a TV interview yesterday, we do have monetary space to respond. We are one of the few countries where interest rates are not very low. We can lower it. Inflation is not a major concern. The headline number may be being impacted by lockdown-related disruptions, but there's no underlying inflationary pressure in the system. Real estate prices are falling, if anything. WPI is clearly showing the demand side is weak, if anything. So inflationary pressures on a systematic basis are not a concern to monetary responses. There can be a debate about transmission, but there is space. On the fiscal side as well, we have space and we are willing to use it. Our debt to GDP ratios are much, much lower than that of Western countries. And given that, ultimately the sustainability of debt is about growth and our growth rates are much higher than that of Western countries, we can have higher debt to GDP ratios than in fact the West does. So we do have space and we are willing to use it, and we will use it, particularly when it comes to build out of infrastructure to rebuild demand. And we are getting into that loop. I think if you listen to the Prime Minister's speech, you would have had a hint of that as well. So as we go into pushing the accelerator, a build out of infrastructure is very much on the cards. So that is something important. And let me assure you that we take that seriously. So that is where we are at. But this conversation that we had here is about Atmanirbhar Bharat, and I'm going to now come to that very briefly. You see, there has to be a supply side element to what we are doing, not only because there is so many supply side things that need to be done in India in order to make it more efficient. There's so many inefficiencies everywhere. India needs reforms, but also because of another element of our thinking, which is that we are quite sure that we are not re-inflating the pre-COVID world into the post-COVID world. So whatever we do, we have to take into account that the post-COVID world will have its own logic. It will have its own technologies. It will have its own supply chains, its own geopolitics, its own consumer behavior. So the most important part of this has got to be towards being, one, being willing to change and be adaptable, two, to be self-reliant, and I'll come to that word, why we use Atmanirbhar, and we have to be willing to do new things in an adaptable, non-ideological way. This is important here. So now we come to what does Atmanirbhar mean? Let me assure you that Atmanirbhar Bharat is not a return to 1950s self-reliance in terms of import substitution being the leading light. It is also not a return to Sarkar Nirbhar Bharat of licenses and permits and so on. However, Atmanirbhar Bharat does mean that we will protect national interest in ways that a textbook free market world may not imply. For example, we have deliberately not gone into the RCEP. We did not think it would play into our national interests, and I think events have proven that that line of thought was perhaps right. We have done the same thing, for example, with all the bans with apps that we recently did. So we will be willing to do, what should I say, unorthodox measures where necessary to protect national interests. That doesn't mean that we do not see the importance of being part of the global supply chains. We are very keen on being a part of global supply chains. We are putting in a lot of effort to get international companies to move to India, to set up shop here, and you will see some of those measures bearing fruit very, very shortly, because we are in talks with some very big companies. Maybe some of you head those companies, so you already know about it. And we are putting in a lot of effort, consequently, into removing the impediments in the way. This is an important thing, that supply side measures help get rid of supply hurdles in the system. This is important for Atmanirbhar Bharat. One of the areas where there were lots and lots of hurdles was the agriculture sector. People talk about China's success. Well, China began its success story with the reform of the agriculture sector. This is now 3 decades since 1991, and we had not begun to liberalize our agriculture sector. We did that just a couple of months ago with the unwinding of and beginning to amend the Essential Commodities Act, and state by state paring down the APMC Acts. Why is this important? Well, just think about it. Many of you produce goods. How would you like it if we had a system where cars, for example, had to be taken to a certain mandi and be sold at fixed prices, or soaps or any mobile phones had to be sold at fixed and arbitrary prices in a mandi? It wouldn't work. That market would die. That was also true of our agriculture sector. It was outdated rules. Many of them, by the way, these APMC rules were there. Their origins lie on East India Company rules from the early 19th century, where they were essentially forcing Indian farmers to sell opium and raw cotton and indigo to the East India Company at controlled prices because of their own requirements. And it's astounding that 72 years after independence, we continued with these colonial era policies in India in agriculture, which affected hundreds of millions of people. So we are getting rid of that. And you will see the impact of this on our agriculture and rural sector very, very clearly. Same thing we are beginning to do also with our labor markets. You will clearly see we are, for years and years, we have heard about how our labor markets were jammed up, not flexible, and so on. We are putting in a huge effort of unwinding them, both at the central level and at the state level. This does not mean that India does not need labor laws. Of course, it needs labor laws, but the emphasis of those labor laws is on safety. It is on the working conditions, but on the same time, it is allowing for flexibility in order that we are able to adapt to this new post-COVID world where old jobs will be destroyed, but new jobs will also be created, and we need a labor force that is able to adapt to this environment. Same thing we are doing within the government itself. If you watch carefully, you will see major reforms are being done. For example, on the tax front, we are anonymizing the entire process of keeping track of tax filings and so on, which just 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago was announced by the Prime Minister, that the whole process will be anonymized and there will be minimal face-to-face interaction between the tax authorities and the taxpayer. In addition to that, we are doing something that several developed countries have, which is to introduce a taxpayers charter where a set of taxpayer rights have been clearly laid out. You can read them online, and we are now putting in place ways and making sure that they're enforceable. But again, there are very key differences in there. For example, there used to be a practice, many of you may have been at the receiving end of it, that if somebody was untaxed, somebody's taxes were under scrutiny, this information would be passed on to the media, and this would lead to embarrassment. Sometimes it would mean, sometimes contracts and loans, etc., would get questioned, and it would really throw off the person who was being scrutinized. Now, that was clearly a tool that could lead to harassment and rent seeking. We have now, as per the Taxpayer Charter, clearly written out that tax scrutiny cases are entirely confidential and that privacy will have to be maintained. So, this is just one of them. Same thing, there is clearly written about timeliness. The tradition was, tax cases would just keep hanging forever. You would never get a clean chit. Now that is being undone, you will have to be given a clean chit. Cases have to be closed after a period of time. So, you can clearly see that we are putting in place a lot of new things. A large number of, by the way, defunct organizations in the government are being shut down for the first time since independence again. You can Google them up. There used to be a large number of advisory groups and, jute advisory group and handloom board and so on. So all of these groups, you can see, you can Google them up and you can see they've already been gazetted, and many of these organizations have been shut down. Now, some of the activities of these organizations still need to be done. I mean, handicrafts, handlooms, etc., important sectors. But they will now be done in one clearly designated organization, which will be properly resourced and staffed, rather than have it in large numbers of disparate organizations. So what we are doing is step by step moving forward. Now, what do we want to do going forward? Well, there are a large number of things we want to do, but one of the things that I have spoken about and I've written about in the economic survey as well, a major thing that we need to do to be Atmanirbhar has got to do with enforcement of contracts. That is a major issue in India. This is something that both the government and the judiciary need to work together and try and resolve. It comes up all the time in ease of doing business surveys. We are ranked on enforcement of contract 163 out of 190 countries, which is not good, given that the countries below us are mostly countries that are essentially at war or are dysfunctional. So there are things we need to work on. But let me say that one step at a time, we are beginning to do a lot of things. Now, let me stop here and pass this back so that we can have a conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sanyal. It's been, a very brief but yet, very meaty presentation. And let me take advantage of the clarity with which you have talked. So I have a few points based entirely on what you've said, the things that happen in my own mind. Now, a simple, let me first take this idea that, you have, tried to find your way, which looks very good because none of us knew what this is. There is fundamental uncertainty. So I really appreciate, the point that, India is trying to find its way. And therefore some things may have looked, funny, but they're not actually. There is this idea of hysteresis. So if you have not acted at the right time, the losses may not be recoupable. Okay. And my own analysis tells me that the decline of GDP in India is likely to be anywhere between 8 to 11% if there is no more, let's say, action on the part of the government. Hopefully that would not be the case and there would be action. But it's rather steep. And if we compare even at this stage, estimates of what the decline that would happen in India vis-a-vis that elsewhere in the world, then it's likely to be much sharper in India. And I would also add to this by saying that unlike elsewhere in the world, the aspect of migrant labor kind of, prevents a very quick action. The other thing is that the lockdowns, having been territorial rather than functional, kind of did not recognize the interlinkages in society, and as a result, perhaps had a much sharper effect on the economy, okay, than what was intended or than what was anticipated. Okay. Now it's good. So this is the first point I have. The second point is, it's great
You
that
have to take them one at a time, otherwise I'll begin forgetting them.
Sure. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So bear with me, because otherwise I'll keep asking you what the question was.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me say that about the issue of territorial rather than functional. Well, one can debate this issue, but let me tell you why we used what we did. You have to remember that we are starting with a given administrative mechanism. This administrative mechanism is set up in a certain way for lockdowns. Now, you're right that they are probably set up for a curfew, for a riot or something like that, and therefore tends to have this territorial thing. Fair point. But the point is, remember, we have a certain administrative mechanism in place, and I have certain legal powers in place. So consequently, I have no choice but to use them. Now, to retraining in the middle of a crisis, and one in which, by the way, I can't ask people to come to a, retraining them in one location. I can't even get policemen to come to one place and train them, right? I have to use on the fly what mechanisms exist. So that is one point here. So therefore, if we are using mechanisms that sound and feel like they are meant for a curfew, a political driven curfew, then yes, you're absolutely right, because those are precisely the machinery that we have used, because that is what exists. Now, as we have gone through time, we have tried to be more functional. But by the way, using functional lockdowns is quite tricky as well, because you see, it's only when you impose these functional lockdowns, then you realize that certain functions have linkages to other functions that you did not actually, in practical terms, know. It's only when you actually put them in and then you lock down something, you realize that actually this particular function, if you can't do, it may be a completely everyday function where it causes breakdown of 3 other functions that you have allowed but now cannot be done. So if you say you lock down the metro railway and the taxis, there's no point in opening up many other things because nobody can get to where they have to. I'm just giving you as an example. So given all of these factors, we used what was available. We have learned a lot through iteration along the way. And so hopefully we are now able to keep things moving in ways that are better than we were able to do earlier. But yes, once this episode is over, we will do a full look through the whole mechanism and hopefully create a protocol for future responses to a similar situation. But it is no point in telling us to do this right now, because I have those guys you're asking me to retrain are on the ground running things right now. The other point you made about GDP growth, yes, there will be a large drop, particularly for the number for the April to June quarter, and the July to September quarter also will be hit. Putting a number to it is very difficult, as you know, but I think the Reserve Bank has also pointed this out. It will be a significant hit. Now, there are 2 parts to it. One of them is a purely lockdown-driven hit, which I'm not too concerned about, because that will pop back up next year when presumably we will not be in lockdown. So that part of it, let's say it's minus, you said -8. So you'll get a pop back up next year of a significant number. So I'm not too concerned about that. The problem, which is the second point you made, which is about hysteresis, i.e. not the one-time loss, but the trajectory change that may have happened, let's say, because people have permanently stopped doing certain kinds of activities. Say businesses have shut down. Migrants have gone back forever and never to come back. and so on. That is the point you're making about hysteresis, a permanent change in direction. Now, in that context, we are obviously also concerned. This is precisely the reason why we have put in so much effort. First, the area where we were most concerned was obviously in causing a cascades of defaults happening, particularly in the MSME sector. Because many of these companies may, under normal circumstances, be perfectly good companies. But because of this shock have shut down. But once you shut them down, they have shut down. So just because demand now in future comes back, it doesn't mean these companies will come back. And then you will have an awkward situation. The demand comes back and you get inflation because the productive capacity doesn't exist anymore. So we were very keen that these companies are somehow kept going. That is why we created that moratorium, first of all. That is the context in which we created the 100% government guarantee for loans to this sector. And now, more recently, we have come up with a one-time restructuring with the banks. All of this is aimed towards keeping alive the sector onto the other side of this cycle, when hopefully demand will begin to recover at least to some normalcy. So your point about hysteresis, absolutely on the ball. It is a serious issue we think about all the time. However, we have to also add to it a further twist, which I mentioned earlier. It is all very good to keep things alive to the other side of this cycle, but also remember, we are keeping them alive to the other side of the cycle at a time. We don't know whether the demand recovery will happen in the trajectory that was existing beforehand. And I'll give you one example.
Sure.
Now, let us say we have all become used to using Zoom. It is not obvious to everybody that we will go back to working in our offices in the way we did before this. This could change in education, in the field you are in. There are many, many sectors where we may never go back to offices in the same way, or the layouts of the offices. So now we have inherited all this historical real estate of office buildings. Now, most of those office buildings may be of no use anymore. What do you do with them?
Yeah.
So this is also part of your hysteresis. Now, but I unfortunately do not know. So this is the reason why this feedback loop approach is the best I can do, and keeping things flexible and respond as we go. And of course, in the longer run, we can't keep giving everybody moratorium. The insolvency and bankruptcy court system will have to be used. We cannot keep eternally allowing people to
I think
structure.
Got the point.
All of these things will be a part of the solution.
Yeah, let me go on to the next one, which is good that you said that the space for both fiscal and monetary expansion is very large for India. Now, I would like to add to that and say that, look, in a situation of fundamental uncertainty, one of the things that happens is the portfolio demand for money, that means just goes up for liquidity. And if governments don't feed that, you have compounding uncertainty. So it's great that the Western governments, using the fact of their currencies being, reserve currencies, have expanded very greatly. And I would think that that is right for the globe as a whole. Okay, for India, we are not a reserve currency, so some moderation is required. However, we are very large. We happen to command a very large subcontinent, and therefore the scope for both monetary expansion and fiscal expansion is actually very high. However, the sense that we get, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the government is caught in the idea that government budgets are like a family's budget. The kind of deficits cannot be allowed to go out of hand and so on. So a lot of those kind of statements did emerge from the government. So perhaps that kept the demand side from being pepped up early enough. And even today, the entire fiscal side, if I may put it all together, amounts to less than 1% of GDP, maybe a little bit more than 1% now. And which means that it should give us at best about 1.5–2%, kind of cushion in that sense to the growth. So a minimum I would think would have been about 3.5%. And early on, I would have said 2.5% if we had done it early. So now, as we go forward, my sense is a 5–5.5%, if not higher, fiscal stimulus is required. So would actually the government do that, or would it still continue to be constrained by this family budget orientation? Which many economists also suffer from.
So first of all, let me say that we are generally a conservative government in many ways. This is a government that had introduced the monetary policy framework. And by the way, it has been a very successful in doing what it was supposed to do, which is we have converted ourselves from being a high inflation country to being a low inflation country. So in the last several years. So same thing was done with the fiscal side. Lots of constraints were placed on the fiscal side. So in that sense, yes, there is a natural tendency of this government to be conservative on both fiscal and monetary front. And we have got the benefits from that as well. I mean, in terms of having converted a country that was considered a fragile five, macroeconomically unstable country to one which was accumulating reserves. And in fact, our reserves accumulation is accelerating even despite this crisis. We now have 530 billion worth of reserves. And of course, many other things got anchored, particularly inflation. So we did manage to do what we did. Now, this does not mean that we do not recognize that special circumstances need special responses. So as I said, we recognize that the government needs to play a role in terms of demand rebuild. We were, however, all this last several months, not focusing on the rebuild thing. And I said this even in my own presentation, that it was very much about cushioning and safety nets of the system, because this was about our barbell strategy. The first leg of the barbell strategy is about the cushion. We did that with the lockdown on the health front. We were very strict and then we eased it up. We did the same thing on the response. We took a conservative effort, very much targeted to the very poorest people. We did not do what many people told us to do, which is to go out and spend a large amount of money up front, because we considered it being not very useful to be pressing the accelerator just when we were pressing the brakes as well. And in fact, other countries have discovered this as well. If you look at the US and look at the data they gave out large amounts of checks. Even in Europe, large amounts of checks were given out. The discovery is that yes, some part of it got spent, but a lot of it just gets saved. And as a result, the government runs up this debt, but the demand, the second and third order demand impact of it is very, very low because you are in lockdown. So the same thing would have happened here. In fact, our partial data that we have from the Jan Dhan account transfers is also this, that while they may be even among the poor, a small section who had to spend it because they've literally run out of money, but even amongst the poor, people have mostly saved the Jan Dhan transfers, because people who are uncomfortable about their job security, etc., are mostly likely to save. Now, if you're expecting a demand build back as a result of that, it will not going to happen. So now that we have pulled our foot off the accelerator, or there's some of the brake, there's still some left, but we will pull it further back as and when the health situation allows us, then we can push it on the accelerator. As we press it on the accelerator, as I said, we do have space on the fiscal and monetary front. The space on the fiscal front is more limited than on the monetary front, but we do have space. And the way we intend to do it, while there are certain areas like unemployment benefits, etc., may be extended, and some announcements were recently made to that effect, but the big effort will be towards the infrastructure build-out. On the monetary front, we have ammunition. Literally yesterday, the RBI governor made a television interview, which was on CNBC, you can look it up, where he clearly stated that we have kept our powder dry. Now, keeping powder dry does not mean we will not use it. It just means we haven't fired all our ammo. And we will fire this ammunition. That doesn't mean he hasn't cut interest rates. He has cut aggressively interest rates. He has also signaled he will do more. But there are certain issues with transmission. And here, there is some tricky things here, which we are working on, which is to get the banking system to be comfortable enough to lend. By the way, this is trickier than you think, because in some ways, we have also told the banks to be very careful. After all, the last 1 decade of cleaning up of the banks was what? We introduced a large number of measures on them, Basel norms and this and that. And those were meant to stop them from lending to borrowers who may be passing through difficulty. Now, in normal circumstances, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But you see, if every bank becomes risk averse, then the system as a whole becomes pro-cyclical. And this is the problem we now face. But we can't now suddenly tell the banks, go out and lend to whoever you want, because that is precisely what we did in 2007, 8, 9, 10. And then, we spend 1 decade cleaning up banks. That's also not a good thing. So this is a tricky thing that we are navigating. I won't say that, this is something in which we can have a silver bullet. It has to be done carefully of, managing, but it is being done. Of course, as demand comes back in the economy and it grows, and you begin to see companies want to borrow and invest again, then clearly it will build on itself. The problem is, which is the first part of the virtuous cycle? How do you get that going? That is really the tricky part. And that is where the government will have to play a role, particularly in terms of getting large infrastructure projects going again. There are several spade-ready ones, stuck for a variety of reasons, including COVID.
Yeah.
But we need to get those going.
Yeah, I mean, good that you mentioned. I'm tempted to go back, but I'll perhaps do that only after we have some time. But now that you mentioned about infrastructure, yes, I agree with you that, giving cash, even helicopter money may not result in the kind of spending that one would like to. However, infrastructure spending has a huge impact, both on the supply side in the future, of course, and certainly on the demand side. In fact, economists have estimated the multiplier to be as high as 2.7, which is amazing actually, and an immediate multiplier of around 1.5. So, Vajpayee, during Vajpayee's time, we had a great program, the NHDP. Okay. And even today, let me say this, the NHDP and the PMGSY are still the same programs which the government is, squeezing, bone dry as it were. There has been no such creation of a major, what I would call public value creating program, which was broadly right in all its dimensions. Okay. So being a successful program also meant that it was able to lift the economy out of the recession, which we had entered into by around 2002. So 2003-4, just did many things besides improving the roads. So, what could be one kind of infrastructure which is easy, about which there is no, question about the demand, whether today or in the future? I would think, it's urban, municipal, things like sewerage, sanitation, water supply. Okay, why can't the government just sit down and take 2 months and come out with a grand PPP idea with ring-fenced funds and so on, more or less on the lines? Now, my contention is the government will not be able to do it. And correct me if I'm wrong. Because when it happened in the Vajpayee, just let me finish. Just a moment. When it happened under Vajpayee, it really happened despite the bureaucracy. Okay, Mr. Sudhindra Kulkarni was in the PMO, and that's where I see, people like you playing a great role. He was able to push through a creative effort, which the IDFC came on with. So as a professional body, they did the entire thing, and it was pushed onto the MOST, and the MOST accepted it thanks to the pressure which Sudhin was able to apply. Now, if people like you, can really work and overcome the debilities of the Indian bureaucracy, I think we can get going, because I see a very strong commitment on the political side, which can come from, your government. So where is that? I mean, I'm not saying it needs
let me say that I appreciate your point about urban infrastructure being a very big area, that we clearly, Indian cities, even for our per capita income level, are screaming for new infrastructure. There's no doubt about it. I'm not debating you on that. But it is a trickier thing to do than building national highways.
Sure.
The reason is that it is something that ultimately has to be done not even by state governments, but by municipal governments. Now, this is very tricky to do top-down sitting in North Block, let me tell you that. Because it is about large numbers of gears and screws that have to be tightened at the local level. So let me finish my thing. So I'll tell you how it works. So it's easier said than, it's much easier to say lay out a highway network, which is what Vajpayee ji did, than it is to do, because every city will have a somewhat different logic to it. Now, having said that, we do have a major program for water. I don't know if you are aware on this, on tapped water, which we are doing, which follows on in the somewhat disaggregated way that we did the program for toilets, which was successful. So we are having to do it in this somewhat disaggregated way because of the nature of how governments are set up in this country. And by the way, even if we were a centralized government and not a federal structure, the nature of this beast is that you will have to do it in a decentralized way. So we are doing this piped water program that you will be aware of, but we are doing it in a peculiar way that, which is a decentralized way because of the nature of the beast. However, saying that, there are centralized things we can do. First of all, it's not like there aren't more highways to be built. So we are doing that too. Some very major highways are getting upgraded and so on. Northern India, particularly UP, is seeing some very major highway build as we speak. Do Google it up. But there are other things as well. For example, we are doing major build outs of border roads. Now, there are geopolitical reasons for doing it, but they are getting done. I mean, if you look at the road build out in certain areas like Ladakh, of course, it has also triggered certain incidents with one of our neighbors, but we are building those border roads out. There has also been similarly an emphasis on building out new airports. The one in Delhi has basically, I think, now been given out. It's a matter of now that the lockdown is over, the construction to start. I think Zurich Airport has been given the deal. There is one in Mumbai as well that is ready to roll, I believe. But more airports are to be given. In fact, we had auctioned out 6 airports, but there were disruptions, and now we will may have to. They were given to Adani, if I remember right, and there's been some delay because of the COVID, but hopefully it'll now get back on rails. There is a build out happening similarly with the railways. The railways have used this period to relay a lot of lines and signals, etc., because traffic is low. So a lot of upgrading is happening on that front. So there are areas where we are doing build out. There is a national infrastructure pipeline list that is there. You can look it up online, and there's a whole bunch of these things. Now the question here is to speed them up. They are all shovel ready. Point is, are we willing to put the money behind them and do the big build out? That is the real issue that you are asking about. And my answer to that is yes, we are. The Prime Minister clearly stated it. And let me say, that is something we are paying a lot of attention.
Yeah, great. I mean, all I was adding is that, when you get something in design correct, okay, and very rarely have we got that. And I would hardly blame the politician for it, but the Indian system, civil servants and the way they think and so on. But once in a way we do get it, and when we have got it, like under Vajpayee, thanks to the IBFC, it created a kind of an opportunity for the next 15 years. So what I'm saying is that if you get one such thing, let's say the sewerage, sanitation, and water right, the PPPs for it, and the overall ring fencing or whatever that it takes, the entire linkages, and put it down on paper correctly, it can empower and come through. So I don't see central government as doing it in a piecemeal way, but it's the whole idea of getting it all right, in a sense that
I think you should advocate this to the state governments, please. Sure. I know this is a journey. This is a journey. We are all in it together.
The government, if the center gets, let's say, a good, model concession agreement where all the details have been.
No, there are there.
But a good policy, where all the details, interlinkages have been worked out. This can actually go further because then it kind of gets in. See, the general idea, that India has not done as well because of implementation failure, I would beg to differ. It has not done well because we have not designed things correctly. We have not thought through the interlinkages. Anyway, that to the point you have already answered that. Let me go on to another question.
Okay. I think should we open this up into a Q&A, because I think we have only another 15 minutes left. Yeah.
You can ask the question which has come up. Yeah. Will India be benefited from the world's recent attitude towards China because of the alleged origin of COVID-19 as well as its expansionist approach? If yes, then how much and in which sectors majorly? So people want your insights. Okay.
So there is no doubt that geopolitics has historically always played a major role in how global supply chains function. Okay, this is from the beginning of time. The supply chains for supplying opium from Indian opium to China in the 19th century is what led to the growth of Penang, Singapore, and Hong Kong. All those 3 cities are direct result of supply chains from India used by the East India Company to supply opium and smuggle opium into China. In the 20th century, similarly, the rebuilding of Germany and Japan after the Second World War were as much an economic event as they were a geopolitical event. The subsequent rise of Taiwan and Hong Kong were also geopolitical events. And then following the Nixon-Mao overtures, starting in the 80s, but more clearly in the 90s, the rise of China was also not only an economic event, but it was also a geopolitical event. So geopolitics has always had a lot to do with how economics and particularly supply chains function. So let's be very clear about this. The second point is, there is also no doubt about it that the geopolitics of our times is clearly unwinding. And it is unwinding in many, many interesting ways. This is not only about China and all the people around it and the Quad and all of that. You read about all of this in the newspapers, but even if you read what is happening in the Middle East, the rejigging of the Middle East is also very, very interesting. What is happening between Saudi and Pakistan, and between the rise of Turkey and so on. So this is clearly one of those moments of history where, it's at least as important in terms of reworking as the period between 89 to 91, when the last major rejigging happened at the end of the Cold War. So I think geopolitics is changing. We are clearly an important part of that geopolitics. And I think that is, we understand it in India. The rest of the world understands it. Even America understands it in a bipartisan way. I mean, Twitter wars notwithstanding, at a deeper level, everybody understands what this game is about. And so you will begin to see supply chains beginning to re-establish themselves in other ways. Now, this is not to suggest that we can wish away the existence of China. We will continue to trade with them, even as we continue to compete with them. They are an important and will remain an important part of the global supply chains for the time being or foreseeable future, perhaps forever. But the dynamics of it will have its own logic. And I think, whatever happens, as I said, as a government civil servant, I cannot say things strongly, but let's say India will participate in whatever those new supply chains are.
Yeah, well, there are lots of questions. Let me put a set of them together, which is about the risk of India going autarkic. Okay, autarkic. Okay. Atmanirbhar. Let me frame it a little, better for you. You see, when we look at trade strategies and exchange rate and globalization strategies or exchange or interaction strategies, the only real successes in the second half of the 20th century have been the East Asian countries, and they have all done it through export-led growth. Okay, most others have kind of middling successes, or at best, they have hung on to the coattails of other countries. So these are really the good examples, and and they all followed export-led growth. So what do you think is export-led growth? I mean, export-led growth, to my mind, would be the combination of import substitution and export promotion at the same time. And that cannot happen unless you have aggressive exchange rates, unless you have very relatively low real interest rates, and unless you're willing to tolerate, perhaps a high inflation on agriculture, and not just go killing, manufacturing at the drop of a hat when onion prices go up. Okay, so there is a macroeconomic side to it, there is a trade side to it, and there is an industrial policy side to it. Okay, now when you look at all of them, they're about as uncoordinated as you can imagine in the country. Let's take, while Mr. Modi, as Prime Minister, was trying to push for solar, we had already bound our tariffs on solar panels at ridiculously low rates way back. And we lost the case 3 times in the WTO. Okay, and we made a mess of it. Now, of course, the COVID and other things gave us an opportunity, and we have come out of it. You're absolutely right that we were selling away our, rights on the, by forming treaties with all kinds of countries, which would hit us from below. So in short, what I'm saying is, what according to the government is export-led growth, or what according to the government is Atmanirbhar? Can you specify it a little bit more carefully in economic terms? Because many of our audience, would like to hear it in trade theory, in fiscal and monetary terms, and in industrial policy terms.
So I think I prefer to think of it in industrial policy terms, because if I try, I am incidentally in your school of thought. And if you read the economic survey, not the last one, but the one before that, you will see all the things that you just mentioned there clearly in chapter 1 of volume 1, which I have co-authored. So I am entirely in sympathy to your view. And incidentally, since you mentioned that, we have to allow agriculture to be much more flexible than before, well, that is precisely why we are doing those APMC acts and other things we are trying to get rid of, because, we had this absurd system where every time agriculture prices went up a little bit, you had, an entire sort of army of lower level civil servants whose job it was to go and raid people in the name of calling them hoarders. In 2019 alone, you had 76,000 raids done under the essential commodities and APMC acts, and of which, by the way, only 2% stood up in court. So 98% of them were not even, could not even stand scrutiny. Even the other 2% perhaps were questionable. So I am completely of your school of thought. We have got to free them up, and and that is precisely what we are doing on the agriculture front. As far as the exchange rate is concerned, let's say we are accumulating a lot of reserves recently. You can only do that if you are leaning against an appreciation. So that is happening for a variety of reasons. But there are limits to how much that approach can be taken. There are pros and cons to it. Not the least is that if you overdo it, then you are likely to be marked out by your trading partners as a currency manipulator. So we have to be very careful not to overdo it. There are other problems as well. I mean, accumulating large amounts of reserves when those reserves essentially give you 0 to negative returns is also not fun. So we will do it to some extent, but it is not a strategy without limitations, and we have to be conscious of it. But there is one area where I think that we can do a lot more, which is to lower the cost of capital in India very structurally. And that is for everybody. I mean, there is no reason in a world where interest rates are basically 0 in the rest of the world, where even the central government borrows at almost 6% for 10-year money. And so a structural lowering of the cost of capital in our system is definitely something that we need to work harder at. So the other things, we are already doing it. This one, we have to work harder at. Now here, the transmission issue is an important one, and I need to come to it. It's trickier than you think. We have lowered actually the policy rates. And if you look at short-term rates, they have come down a lot. So if government wants to raise 1-year money, we can raise it at 3.5%. Just look at your 1-year T-bill rate. The problem is that your longer term rate is simply not coming down. Why is it not coming down? Well, one part of it is that the system still does not believe in the structural inflation having come down. And we may claim that it has come down, but clearly there are inflationary expectations still embedded in the system. There is nothing much we can do about it till it filters through. Because after all, we have been a low inflation country only for 4-5 years. So I'm not too surprised if somebody is taking a 10-year view of the world, that they will look at it with some suspicion. But even here, I think slowly but steadily, this rate is being coaxed down. For example, if today you go and try and take if you want to buy an apartment and you take a real estate loan as an individual, you will get loans below 8%. I think it's 7-point-something% you will be able to get a loan. So here too, it is beginning to filter through. But yes, I agree. There is no reason why our interest rates shouldn't be even lower.
Yeah. So people want to know. One of the question is, what are the direct measures that government is planning to take to protect jobs and so on? I thought you'd kind of look through this, and so on. Yeah. So if I may go back, to one of the things that you raised, you see, I am a bit concerned about the RBI's stance, or the stance of the MPC. How are you going to overcome that? Because every time, as I said, agricultural inflation, even CPI inflation. Now you have a situation where, given the COVID, there is a fracturing of the agricultural markets. The wholesale prices are low, but the retail may be high. Now, if the central bank responds to this, how are you going to overcome that? Remember, in China, what you said, besides liberating their agriculture, they ensure that you're not going to hit the demand side through macro policy right over the 80s, and even agricultural inflation may have risen as high as 20%. Okay, but they did that, and the labor absorption was very high. India has had one of the lowest labor absorption rates, because our manufacturing has remained practically out there. Okay,
so if you want my response to that, let me say that I have to be careful what I say, because ultimately interest rates are a prerogative of the Monetary Policy Committee.
Sure.
And so I have to be very careful about what I say. But nevertheless, my views on interest rates are well known. And I have for a long time advocated that Indian interest rates do need to come down structurally. The governor himself said that there was scope for lowering interest rates further. So I will take him at face value on this.
Yeah, so the labor participation rates, people talked about jobs. Let me put it like this. In India, continue to be low. And it's not something which is a feature of the recent past or anything. I don't really go with the idea that the unemployment has increased very dramatically over the Modi years as compared to other years. It has been high, it has wavered, we didn't have the data, now we have it. So the point I'm trying to make is, however, the employment proportion or the total labor participation, which is a better measure, has been extraordinarily low, and particularly in comparison to our neighbors of East Asia, where it has been extremely high. Women's participation has been very low. Now, how would you actually have an Atmanirbhar going if the participation rate cannot go up very sharply? And of course, one part of it is the demand side, but I'm sure there are, as you would say, there are supply limitations as well. Women don't want to come out and work given the conditions in factories or whatnot.
So I would argue that there is no doubt that given our demographics, we need to create more jobs.
Yeah.
This is a slightly different issue from protecting jobs to creating jobs. I always prefer to go with creating jobs, because particularly in this COVID environment, if we are saying that we are going to be reinflating a different post-COVID world from the one that we exited before COVID, then I would say that we need to create the new jobs of this new environment. So I am very much about labor flexibility. This has to be a key ingredient of how we think about this whole thing. We cannot think about this in terms of protecting each and every job. Now, obviously, there are some transition costs here, and that we should cushion it in whichever way we can. But that is why, nevertheless, if you look at the efforts we are putting into improving the labor flexibility at multiple levels, and by the way, many states have put together reforms on this front. The central government as well has taken 44 laws and converted them into 4 codes, and 2 of them are already passed, 2 more are on the way. So that is something that we take seriously, but ultimately we need the demand growth and the job creation that is there in order to absorb these people. And here I would say that there is a lot to be done in terms of reinflating the demand. That's why I came to the point that if you look through the history of growth, a lot of it has got to do with infrastructure creation and urbanization. Now, you can have different urban models. I'm not saying everybody has got to move to NCR and Mumbai. Urbanization can be disaggregated as well. I mean, Germany's urbanization is much more disaggregated. Britain's or France's is much more focused on one city. But nevertheless, we can have more disaggregated urbanization that requires the kind of infrastructure build-outs, which you also argued about. So one good thing that is happening is that Udan is a very important element of this, because by creating functional airports in 3rd-tier cities, it allowed connectivity in a very major way. So that is, I think, something that we were succeeding in doing, again, disrupted by this, but it was something that was working. The other thing is, of course, the very fact that we are sitting here all over the world and are able to literally interact face to face. This is actually a unique thing. And we should take advantage of it, because it allows us to create these jobs in situ in places that we could never have imagined create those jobs. So, for example, if we wanted to do back office outsourcing in large scale, we had to do it by building gigantic factory-like buildings in, say, Gurgaon or Bangalore. Whereas those workers may have been coming to work from Varanasi or Gorakhpur or some such place. This infrastructure that we have now created allows us to do this. So we are able to, in a disaggregated way, able to do things better. But this does not mean that it will just happen by itself. One is obviously the pure infrastructure build out of telecommunications, etc. But our own regulations have to be updated. So let me give you some examples of the regulations we have to update. Till now, if you wanted to be about back office running person, you had to actually register every single OSP. I forget what OSP stands for, but it's basically a BPO operation. And every single location had to be registered. Now, come COVID, everybody's told to work from home. Now, in theory, this entire thing is illegal.
Yes.
But we have consequently had to adopt to it, not because a civil servant suddenly came up with the wisdom, but because the situation changed and we were forced to change. Now the laws will be changed to align with the work from home. The same thing we did, for example, there were a lot of worries about safety, security angles, etc., about working on the cloud, because there were rules, there still are rules about the fact that every data had to be passed through certain EPABX and so on. Yes, those rules still exist, but again we have had to change or at least reconsider them, because everybody is now working off the cloud sitting at home.
Yeah.
So all of this has to be done. I mean, these, of course, because of the emergency situations, we have temporarily not applying these laws, but these laws need to be updated to allow these things to be done. So it's now, so we have to change, no question about it. And by the way, since many of the people in the audience are people who run businesses who will be facing these kinds of outdated rules, regulations, restrictions, which no longer make sense, please, please, please tell us what those rules are. Put in a little bit of effort to tell us exactly what that regulation is, what act, what regulation, which particular body has put it together. Send it to us. We will change them for you.
Yeah, great. One set of questions actually, but I'll put them simply in.
Yeah, it'll have to be the last set, because I think
I know we have really squeezed you. Yeah. Which sectors do you think India focuses upon in this whole effort of Atmanirbhar? Electronics, defense. Which are the sectors that you think are the low-hanging fruits, and why? And where do you think it can take us? So. Is there any thought on it, or would it be something again, which would be rolling and you find it as
well, to some extent, it has to be rolling.
Yeah.
And I personally have a intellectual block against government telling the private sector what will be the next best thing. Simply because I think governments are usually poor at choosing winners. I'm now a civil servant, so let me say that it would, in an earlier life, I would have mocked the principal economic advisor for choosing what the next technology was going to be. So I will at least be intellectually honest and say that in the end, I want maybe members of the audience to tell us what those great new sectors will be, rather than us telling you what it is. Nevertheless, there are areas which we can see where government intervention may be needed or will benefit. Now, one area is obviously defense, because government itself is such a big buyer of, and it is the buyer of that product. And there are geopolitical and security reasons why we do want to create certain amount of capacity at home. We cannot just rely on a free market approach to this. So you have seen a lot of effort being made, and in fact, a list of goods have defense-related products are now being phased into being purely produced at home. They could be produced by domestic companies, but we are open to foreign companies relocating to India as long as they produce it in India. This will obviously, quite apart from generating activities and jobs, it will also create skills in those ideas and build out. And by the way, the defense sector has historically in every country been a very major source of high-end skills. So it's a very important part of your clustering point. There is also a case for resilience reasons for protecting certain areas. So we know that we are very, very competitive in generic drugs. But we discovered that during this crisis that we were so dependent on certain APIs that, and even ignoring geopolitical clashes, etc., with China, the very fact that you can suddenly find yourself without inputs for a major industry because of a disruption in a third country came as a fair amount of wake-up call. There's clearly a case for protecting a certain amount of capacity for key things at home. And here we will have to choose winners because we can't save everything, but we'll have to choose the key guys. We'll have to give them some protection. This is not import substitution of the old kind. This is a resilience argument, a black swan event argument for protection of certain industries. This is not about some misplaced nationalism or misplaced view of import substitution. Then comes the whole point about certain areas where we do need to put in effort because you need to create a cluster if you want to compete in the global supply chain. Here, for example, electronics is an area where we would love to be a part of if you want to be a China plus one strategy, we want to be a part of that China plus one strategy and be the plus one. And hopefully someday people will think of China as an India plus one strategy. But that does mean that we have those clusters here. It doesn't mean that only Apple or Samsung moves here. Their whole ecosystem has to be moved here. Why should they move here? You'll have to make special arrangements for it. So that requires many things. Many of those things are not central government things, by the way. They are state government things. We have done some things generically, like, for example, lower corporate tax rates. Last year, about a year ago, we did that. But we will have to still provide certain special things, land acquisition and various other arrangements may have to be made for that. So we are willing to do that. You may be already seeing those changes. And if you bring us some sectors generally that may require special help, we'd be willing to do that. But as a general principle, let me say, where there is an overwhelming reason for government intervention and building out certain capacities, we will do it. But I am always at the back of my mind skeptical about government intervention in a generic way, because that always leads to bad things in the longer run. Even the sectors where we are providing protection, with the exception of defense, most of those others should be able to stand on their own 2 feet at some point in the foreseeable future. Otherwise, we will have the ambassador syndrome. We don't want to go back to driving ambassadors.
Okay, so I guess Akhilesh, Anurag, how are we on time? And
I think we are good. I think Akhilesh, I'll request Akhilesh to do the honors and close the session now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you, Professor Morris. Sanjeev, I must say this is one of the most attended and obviously the longest lasting webinar that we have had, so which is a testament both to the speakers who have come in here and the sort of content that got discussed. We have not seen a drop in participation over the last 75 minutes almost. So to that extent,
how many people were there?
Quite fascinating. We had about 250 people in all, a few logged in on Zoom, about 200 or so, and 50 simultaneous watches is what I saw on YouTube. Typically, the YouTube number will go into 4 digits or more over the next few days and weeks. So this has been, as I said, one of the better ones for us, a wide range, of course. And for me, I think an interesting takeaway on the barbell strategy that you mentioned, that there is indeed a broad range of thinking on how to deal with uncertainty and uncertain environments and keep your options open. I think that came through in a wide variety of ways in which you mentioned for health as well as economy. Personally, for me, very happy to hear aviation come up and the idea of more airports being built up, and the UDAN scheme that you mentioned, a few of the things that I was part of earlier in my earlier life and in Delhi. So happy to hear that that focus continues. As a banker now, I found 2 or 3 interesting things. The idea of transmission of rates, and that's something that as a representative of a private large bank in India, I find very interesting and fascinating that the government has been talking a lot about, and I think we try significantly for the transmission to happen. But as you said, it is a vexed problem and something that requires a lot of joint effort and work for us to make that happen. One of the things that has somewhat spooked the markets have been the recent events in the credit markets with respect to the mutual fund industry that you are aware of. And I think we need to be able to create competing environments and competing markets such that the cost of capital in India begins to come down. And one of the things that we take away as a takeaway for the public policy alumni special interest group is the opportunity that you have said is that if there are specific ideas of what can and should change, we should bring them to you. We will use this forum to channelize a few of these ideas and maybe come back to you and the wider government with our thought papers and notes, etc. And look forward to a long and big engagement with you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Goodbye.
Okay, bye.